All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're getting into something pretty big. We're looking at a source that presents a really controversial historical theory. It's one that completely challenges some of the core stories we hear about the origins of modern Jewish populations, and, you guessed it, it has some huge political implications.
So, the whole thing kicks off with this claim. Our source attributes it to political figures like Mike Huckabee. And this one statement, it really sets the stage for everything that follows. We're about to dive into a complicated counterargument that questions, well, not just the politics, but the actual geography and even the religious basis of that promise.
Okay, here's how we're going to break this down. We're going to unpack this source's argument in 6 main parts. We'll start with a fresh look at some ancient texts. Then we'll get into a really significant historical hypothesis. And finally, we'll see how it all supposedly connects to modern science, politics, and even the media.
Right, so first up, let's tackle this territorial claim. The source argues that this whole Nile to Euphrates idea might actually be based on a huge geographical misunderstanding.
All right, so the source starts its whole challenge right here, basically on a map. It says, hold on a second. While a lot of people think the River of Egypt means the giant Nile River, the source claims the original Hebrew in some text actually says Nahar Misraim. And what's that? Well, according to them, it's the Wadi El Arish, a much smaller stream that only flows sometimes. If that's true, it completely changes the map of the Promised Land.
Moving on, the source dives deep into the theology, making the case that the very nature of this ancient promise, or covenant, is something a lot of people get wrong.
So the source lays out this 4-step argument from a theological angle. First, it claims the promise of the land was never a blank check. It was conditional on obedience. Second, disobedience led to those big exiles, the Babylonian and Assyrian ones. Third, the promise to return. The source says that was fulfilled when Cyrus the Great of Persia let them come back. But here's the kicker, step 4. The second exile, the one by the Romans in 70 AD, well, according to this view, that permanently voided the whole deal.
In building on that point, the source brings up another key religious argument. It claims that for centuries, traditional Jewish theology actually forbade a large-scale political return to the Holy Land. The idea was that this should only happen when the Messiah arrives. So from this perspective, the Zionist movement of the 19th century was actually a major break from that long-held religious belief.
Now this is where things take a huge turn from theology to history. The source introduces the core of its argument, and it's definitely the most controversial part, the Khazar hypothesis.
So what is this hypothesis? Well, it suggests a totally different family tree from most of today's Ashkenazi Jews, those from European descent. The argument is that their ancestors weren't from the Middle East at all. Instead, they came from a powerful Turkic empire in Eastern Europe, the Khazars, who decided to adopt Judaism as their state religion.
This timeline gives you the historical context. For a while, the Khazar Empire was a real powerhouse, right there between the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic Caliphates. The source suggests their conversion to Judaism was a savvy political move. Then, when the empire eventually fell, its people scattered across Eastern Europe, and the claim is that this is the real origin of the large Jewish communities we later see in places like Russia and Poland.
Now, a big name that comes up in our source is the author Arthur Koestler. His book, The 13th Tribe, is the one that really brought this whole idea into the mainstream. And this quote, it just gets right to the heart of it. Koestler's point was pretty explosive. If this theory is true, he argued, then the entire ethnic and genetic foundation for a modern Jewish state in the Middle East gets completely turned on its head.
And to back this up, the source brings in a few other voices. It points to Israeli historian Shlomo Sant, who argues that the very idea of a single Jewish people is a modern invention. It also mentions the Egyptian scholar Jamal Hamdan, who drew a line between what he called converted Jews and wandering Jews. And then there's the linguist Paul Wexler, who puts forward the wild theory that modern Hebrew is basically a Slavic language in disguise.
Okay, so in this next part, the source tries to bridge this historical theory with modern science, and it does so by making a really sharp political accusation.
So the source asks this really direct, really provocative question. It basically says, hey, in a country that's a leader in science and tech, why is it supposedly so hard for regular citizens to get their DNA analyzed? And the answer the source gives is, well, it's a huge accusation. It claims that a national ban or restriction on DNA testing is in place for one specific reason: to hide genetic evidence. The argument is that this is all to stop people from finding anything that might contradict the official story of a direct, unbroken line all the way back to the ancient Israelites. To try and make this feel current, the source pulls in this question, reportedly asked by American commentator Tucker Carlson. You can see how it zeroes in on that seeming contradiction, having family roots in Eastern Europe while also making an ancestral claim to land in the Middle East. That's the exact tension the Khazar hypothesis is all about.
So from history and science, the argument widens even further. Now the source claims that a network of modern, elite families are the ones pulling the strings and crafting these geopolitical stories.
Okay, this table really maps out the connections that the source is claiming. It alleges that these incredibly powerful financial families, like the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers, are actually of Khazar descent themselves. And the theory goes that they then bring in political allies, like Mike Huckabee, to push the religious stories that ultimately help their bigger agendas.
The source's argument here really boils down to this. This isn't about real religious belief. It's about using faith as a tool. The claim is that these powerful families weaponize religious ideas to get armies of supporters on board for projects that are really just about politics and money.
And that brings us to the final piece of the puzzle. The source argues that this whole conflict isn't just about land or politics, it's a battle of stories, fought in our media and in our culture. So how do you fight a powerful story? According to the source, you fight it with another story. It actually calls for what it calls a white cultural revolution. And the weapons in this revolution aren't guns, they're things like TV shows. It specifically mentions a series called Owners of the Land, designed to push a counter-narrative out into the world.
And that brings us to the final takeaway from this source, which isn't really an answer, but a question for all of us. In this age of information overload, with so many competing stories, the source leaves us with this final challenge. Who actually gets to control the narrative of history? It's something to think about.